welcome. This is the Boundless Book Club. Normally, we would talk about books, what we're reading, and what has inspired us when we see each other at the Emirates Literature Foundation. But right now, we're here bound in our homes, just like you. So instead, we're talking here digitally, and we hope that you will join us. Today, we will be talking about poetry, and you are here with
Annabelle,
Andrea,
and me, Ahlam. So let's get started, girls. So talking about poetry, let's first start getting into it by what role does poetry play in your lives? Are you a fan or not? How difficult was the research for this episode? So let's start with maybe Annabelle.
Oh, okay. Poetry has always played a slightly random role in my life. I think I turn to it when I need consolation or comfort. I think poetry is where I go to engage with like dark and difficult emotion more than novels, which I didn't realize until I shared that.
I feel like it is such an emotional experience. I don't know why. I mean, does anyone really read poetry for something light?
I wouldn't say light, but when we get on to our recommendations, I prefer poetry that is possibly not quite as sincere and directly emotional, but a bit more clever and witty. So I would not go to it when I'm really, really happy or really, really sad. I just kind of pick it up because I want to be amused or entertained, usually, unless it's performance poetry, which is completely different, which is just a whole different ballgame.
So on the performance poetry point, and also the word emotion, that's something that I find a bit difficult. So I can read more poetry than I can listen to. So if something is quite emotional on the page, I can engage with it a lot better in my own headspace than somebody doing a shouty performance piece about it. I find it very confrontational sometimes when performance poets who are wonderful talk about their feelings at a decibel and an intensity that I'm not ready to experience in a group setting. Does that make any sense?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I know what you mean. It's a very delicate place where it's got to be just the right amount of expressiveness to help you connect. Sometimes when it's like too loud or too harsh, it's like, okay, we're just here for an evening out and we're just kind of having a laugh just now, and that got dark really quickly. But yeah, I do get it. I mean, sometimes when it's like a lot more soft, and even if it's not quite a performance, it feels a lot more sincere if it's in the, genuine tone of the author. What do you guys think about like going off a certain structure as well? Because poetry's evolved a lot, especially with the younger generation and performance poetry. It's more about the music, it's more about the sort of flow of emotion than it is a certain structure. What do you guys think about that?
Again, I think there's a big difference between whether you're reading it or listening to it, what we're engaging with a performance. If it's a performance, then nobody's going to care about how accurate it is and if it's got the right number of syllables per line. But when you're reading it, I think it's a bit harder to take on that sort of randomness that a performance can have. What do you think, Annabelle?
I don't take kindly to some work that sounds good some work that sounds good when it's performed because there's a lot of emotion behind it, but then you read it on the page and it's like you can't just call it a poem because you've put each word on a new line. It doesn't work that way. And there has to be some meaning behind the structure. And I think one of the things that gets lost in performance poetry is things like concrete poems, where the shape of the poem on the page is actually tied in somehow to what's being said. I find those really interesting, and that's not something that you can experience in performance poetry in the same way that you can on a page. But I think when we talk about our poems today, the ones that I'm sharing with you and with the listeners are ones that work on paper, and I haven't really thought about them from a performance point of view.
Performance perspective.
Yeah, interesting.
That makes a lot of sense.
Should we
I really want to know what you guys I want to know what you guys have selected. Tell us. Well, Annabelle, while you're in the flow, tell us what you've chosen.
So I've decided to highlight an online collection that I'm a fan of, and I think will be helpful to anybody who can't kind of go out and buy any new poetry books at the moment. It's called poetryfoundation.org. It's one of my favorite places to explore for poems because of just the range of poems that they have on the site, and also the way it's laid out. Because I feel with poetry, it's kind of like photographs. Each one is a snapshot of a certain place and time, and it's like flicking through an album almost. And that's how I like to explore the site. So poems are sorted into collections that range from blockbuster movie poems to, I've got some more here, anti-love poems, which is another collection I love, poems of hope and resilience, and more collections along those lines. And they're grouped in very creative ways. And it's a great way to explore poems and poets that you would never have come across otherwise. Because I think I get stuck in the old favorites that I kind of learned at school and I find comfort in. So it's nice to be pushed out of that a little bit sometimes. So in the true spirit of discovery, I'm highlighting a poem by Tracy K. Smith, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning poet with her collection Life on Mars in 2011, I think. And she was the US Poet Laureate. She was announced as a US Poet Laureate in 2017. And I'd never read a single one of her poems and was slightly ashamed by that. I find the best poems either make the ordinary extraordinary or the extraordinary ordinary. And for the most part, I like ones that take things like there's a Pablo Neruda poem that is about a tomato. And if you told me this poem was about a tomato, I wouldn't have wanted to read it. But it's beautiful and it's exciting and engaging, and it's about a tomato. Who'd have thought? There's a poem that I wanted to talk about today, which I'm only going to quote from, but it's called Aimless Love by Billy Collins. And two of the verses are as follows. In the shadows of an autumn evening, I fell for a seamstress, still at her machine in the tailor's window, and later for a bowl of broth, steam rising like smoke from a naval battle. This is the best kind of love, I thought, without recompense, without gifts or unkind words, without suspicion or silence on the telephone. So that poem is an example of finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. So I've gone completely the other way today, and this Tracy K. Smith poem is about one of the biggest events I can possibly imagine. It's called The Universe, Original Motion Picture Soundtrack. And it's about the sounds that you might hear at the beginning of everything. And if you told me that someone had written a poem about this and been brave enough, I'd have said, no way could they achieve that. Come on, not possible. But she does, and this is The Universe Original Motion Picture Soundtrack. The first track still almost swings. Hi-hat and snare, even a few bars of sax, the stratosphere will singe out soon enough. Synthesized strings, then something like cellophane breaking in as if snagged to a shoe. Crinkle and drag, white noise, black noise. What must be voices bob up, then drop like metal shavings in molasses. So much for us, so much for the flags we bored into planets dry as chalk, for the tin cans we filled with fire and rode like cowboys into all we tried to tame. Listen. The dark we've only ever imagined, now audible, thrumming, marbled with static like gristly meat, a chorus of engines churns. Silence taunts. A dare. Everything that disappears, disappears, as if returning somewhere. And
oh, nice. I almost want Annabelle to just read it to me. Her voice is like hypnotizing the way she does it.
That was very, very good reading, I think.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. But it's because the poem is so good, and it's been an absolute joy having to research something new for this, because I was so tempted to just go with an old favorite, but I would never have discovered the incredible wonder of Tracy K. Smith.
That's awesome.
Very
and it makes
cool.
you want like a poet that's really good with the words. Can again, like you said, that poem about the tomato, it's like it's not really about the essence or what it's about. It's almost just the words and the way that they are put together and structured that is just entertaining regardless and draws you in.
I like cleverness in poetry. I like it when the poet is clever and is doing things that you think, oh, I like what you've done there, which is not exactly the same as putting your emotion on the page.
Andrea, what do you have for us today?
Okay, so let's talk about Dorothy Parker. Do you have a relationship to Dorothy Parker?
I don't. All I know is that we had some cats in the office a long time ago, and we named one of them Dorothy Parker.
Excellent. You know what? I think she would really enjoy that. So Dorothy Parker died more than 50 years ago. She was born, I would say, sometime late 1800s. And it's incredible how relevant and contemporary her poetry feels for women today. So she was kind of dismissed by some people as a flapper poet. She was partying up in the roaring 20s and all sort of, you know, pearls and speakeasies and that sort of thing. But there is just so much more to her. And she was dismissed by the feminists of her time because she wrote a lot of poetry that was about relationships and, you know, catching a man, which the feminists of the time didn't like. But this is stuff that humans, not just women, but humans have been seeking a mate for the entirety of our species, and they're going to continue to do so. And that doesn't make her not feminist, I think. And she is actually, to my mind, a really early feminist icon. And that is not necessarily the reason why you should like her. You should like her because she is clever and she is witty and she is just timeless. I can't imagine a time in the future when young women aren't going to read her poetry and say, oh, that really speaks to me. So that's why you should like her and you should read her. There are lots of collections, obviously, because she's an old poet. There'll be lots of collected works and their best of and so on. They're all going to be great. So I'm gonna read you a poem, but first I just want to read a line out of a poem that I really love. And the other day I was looking at something on Twitter, as you do, and someone I'm not connected to said something quite clever, and I clicked on her bio, and this was her bio. 3 be the things I shall never attain: envy, content, and sufficient champagne. And I thought, oh, that's so clever. She's so great. I don't actually have my collected Dorothy Parker here, but I do have her poems online because you can find anything online right now. And I found it really difficult to choose one because they are all so clever and witty and apt for anyone. So I think I'm going to go with an unfortunate coincidence, which is very short and very typical of her. I think it's a good example of her style. So it's called An Unfortunate Coincidence, and it goes like this. By the time you swear you're his, shivering and sighing, and he vows his passion is infinite, undying. Lady, make a note of this. One of you is lying.
I love it.
That's awesome.
So that's my proposal to you. Get yourself some Dorothy Parker.
Oh, cool. I like that. I feel like my choice is so different than both of yours. I've gone 900 years back.
Excellent.
And I've sort of selected. So this is a poet I've always wanted to know more about because he's so well known in this part of the world. So Omar Khayyam, who is, lived 900 years ago. And so 11th century Persian poet. And there's a bit of, it's kind of, because of how things were at that time and who owned what parts of the map, there's a bit of debate between people in Uzbekistan and people in Iran about where he really was from, because they say at that time he kind of went to Bukhara, and that's the time when he like wrote his most popular works. And he's someone who's so interesting. So he was a mathematician, he was a philosopher, he was an astronomer, but he is mostly well known for his poetry. And some historians say it's not possible that this was the same person. There must have been like two Omar Khayyams, to have been someone who made so many first-time discoveries in algebra, who have, his works have like literally like paved the way for people like Isaac Newton and all these geniuses that came after him, and at the same time be such an important poet, right? But through his poetry, that's where you really understood who he was, what are his thoughts. But he was a genius in every way. Like back in those days in Persia, he was the person in charge of revising the solar calendar, like the Persian solar calendar. And it's said until today that is actually one of the most accurate calendar. So the Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar, but the Persian calendar is the solar one. So just like such a fascinating person, but he's mostly well known for the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and this was obviously his work had gained a lot of popularity in Europe after Edward Fitzgerald, in I think the early 19th century, translated his Rubaiyat. And I think this is his original work of translation, and I found it in House of Prose in Al Wasl Road, that secondhand bookshop, and I got it for like 14 dirhams. I feel like it's a treasure, and I got it for so cheap. And what I love is that the person before me actually, marked the pages that they loved, and I some of them are my favorites too. So Rubaiyat means quatrains, or like 4-line poems, and a lot of people say that actually there was up to 2,000 of these under his collection, but there's only about 75 in Fitzgerald's original translation. So I'll read to you. His work is mostly about contemplation, and it's interesting because he was someone who was so clever. He was someone who found answers, right, in math, in astronomy. He was someone who found definite answers in those things and would solve problems. And I feel like he's someone, through his poetry, it drove him crazy that he couldn't figure out death and life after death and all of those sort of big universal issues that until today we contemplate. And so, it's just like there's a bit of humor in it. There's a bit of, there's like a sarcastic tone underlying in some of his poetry. But Fitzgerald didn't actually take his work as they were. It's sort of like he channeled Khayyam and he made the poetry his own. I mean, I don't know. It's beautiful to read, but I don't know how I feel about, do I really know Khayyam's work through this because Fitzgerald really made it his own or not? But I'll read one of the ones that was marked here to you. "'Tis all a checkered board of nights and days, where destiny with men for pieces plays. Hither and thither moves and mates and slays, and one by one back into the closet lays." I love that one, just like talking about what life really is. And then another one is, fill the cup, what boots it to repeat, how time is slipping underneath our feet, unborn tomorrow and dead yesterday, why fret about them if today be sweet?
Do you tend to go for, when you're choosing poems, do you tend to choose poems that are about kind of big things?
I think so. It's a lot of searching for answers for me. Right. So like you, it is a very emotional experience. Like if I'm having a very emotional day, I do love to read poetry, but it's also like if I'm really wondering about something. And some of these old, timeless poets contemplated a lot of these big topics. So a lot of times you'll find exactly, the subjects that you're looking for, and just read some words about them and try to think along the same lines. And I can't believe that someone who wrote, this 900 years ago till today, it's the same topics that we contemplate. It makes you think that the social construct and the sort of the big social issues are always the same, no matter what time or place we're at. It makes you feel connected as a human race.
It's true. When do you tend to pick up poetry, or when do you read poetry? Do you sort of pick up a poetry book and read it from start to finish, or do you just kind of pick it up, read one, put it down?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever actually done one from start, except for this one. It was quite short, and I did it from start to finish. But like mostly it's just dabbing in and out, or looking for topics or subjects that, catch my eye, and then reading that piece. What about you guys?
I don't know. I feel like you just sort of absorb poetry without even noticing it sometimes. The only poems I remember reading, they've always been in anthologies. So I don't actually read entire collections by the same poet. I find that very strange. I would have to read kind of an anthology and read one person and someone different. It has to be different voices all the time. I can't just sit and read the same voice over and over again.
Yeah. But some pieces are just so, I love when the same piece is read by multiple people, and it can mean something very different to me than to anyone, than to you or to you, Annabelle. So it's like, just like a piece of art, you look at it and you have your own interpretation of what it means and how it resonates. I wonder how important it is for poets that, their exact messages come across, or if they put it out there to connect with people as they wish.
It's a good question. I feel like this applies to novels as well. When you read novels, pass it after, everybody has taken something different from it.
One thing that I will mention is Billy Collins comes up here again, one of my favorite poets. He has written a poem which is about poems. It's called An Introduction to Poetry, and the whole thing is about how he wishes his work would be taught and interpreted rather than how it often is at university or at school. And if you find that dichotomy quite interesting, he's very funny. He's a very funny poet. So I think if you like Dorothy Parker, you'll like Billy Collins and what he has to say about kind of the nature of poetry in a poem itself.
Can I ask you, after this conversation, are you likely to go onto the website that Annabelle recommended, Ahlam, and have a look at new poetry?
I think I would be, after this conversation, I would be likely to look at poetry in a different way, like looking for a more sort of clever and witty approach to comedy, to poetry, not comedy, to poetry, and try to experience it in that way. So I'd want to read both of what you recommended.
Excellent. I'd be interested to read some very old Persian poetry too, actually.
You know what?
I think what's really interesting is it doesn't sound that old. If you pick up Shakespeare, it sounds old, but what you just read sounds like it was written last week.
Yeah, it is very relatable. And another interesting thing about ancient Persian poets, yesterday Sheikha Budur posted something on her social media which was about another ancient Persian poet called Sa'di Shirazi, and he wrote this poem called Bani Adam, and Coldplay actually created a song with that same title dedicated to that poem.
Wow.
Which is pretty cool. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
I thought that was awesome.
What about you, Annabelle?
I think because it's already kind of close to my comfort zone, I can see myself exploring a lot more Dorothy Parker anyway, because I like things that are comedic. I like comedy. I think that I still struggle with poems that are about soul searching, because I just do. And that's a personal thing. And I've read Omar Khayyam's work before, and things like Rumi, and it doesn't speak to me in the way that I think it speaks to a lot of people. and I don't know how to fix that, or whether it even needs fixing.
Maybe you haven't had an existential crisis yet.
Oh, I've had plenty.
But you don't need to fix personal preference. It's your taste. That's fine. You gave it a go.
Yeah.
I think what it is, actually, I've figured it out now. It's the specificity of it. So if things are too vague in a poem, I don't like it. Even this one that's about a big moment, this Tracy K. Smith one, it's about the beginning of the universe. It's about a big thing, but a specific moment in time. And the tomato poem, it's about a tomato. Like, I like my poems to be very focused and structured. Yeah, so I like containment, focus, and structure in poetry. Otherwise, I feel like it's trying to be too much.
I think I like that too, because it's really hard to be clever about the biggest things in life. It's really hard to be witty and super insightful when you're talking about things that are completely unknown, or like your heart is bleeding on a page. That kind of sincerity, I don't really take on very well.
Yeah.
That openness is something that I think you find a lot in a lot of Instagram poetry, and I think I've just figured out now why I struggle to engage with it.
Yeah.
It's open.
Yeah. You also find it in a lot of teenage poetry.
So that's the thing. It's also the phase in your life which you're at. There might be, so maybe 17-year-old Ahlam would never have read Omar Khayyam, but today you're in a different place in your life, and you connect with different things. So I think we do it like, it's not about evolving, but it's just a matter of where you are in your life and what speaks to you in that moment.
That's great. And that is a perfect introduction to our next episode, I think, which is going to be about books or literature, or perhaps poetry, that help the self, or otherwise known as self-help books. And I'm sure we'll all have very different takes on what books help us.
My judgment is already simmering. It's ready to go.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Cool. Well, we look forward to next week's episode. And you can tell us your opinions or suggested topics if you can send us an email on comms@emirateslittafest.com, or you can send us a message on social media. So we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And if you're watching this rather than listening, then you already know that we're on YouTube as well. And if you're listening on audio only, don't forget to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. This has been the Boundless Book Club, the poetry episode. Thanks for listening. Thanks, guys.